When I was in school, we had a police officer come and talk to us about crime and drugs. He stood up in front of the class and he started speaking. Don't do drugs. If you do drugs, I'll easy arrest you for that. Don't graffiti. If you graffiti, I'll easy arrest you for that. And don't shoplift. If you shoplift, I'll easy arrest you for that. And if I arrest yous, you'll never work again. I think this story, it's funny and stupid as it is, tells us something about the police, how they view themselves, how they view people around them, and how they view their role in society. Break our rules and be marked. So in the wake of the murder of George Floyd and the ensuing riots and protests, including the spectacular burning of the Minneapolis police precinct, the role of the police has begun to be questioned in the mainstream, with talk of abolition reaching liberal circles. This has inevitably led to the concept of police abolition being watered down and appropriated by liberal forces. No, they say, we're not really talking about getting rid of the police, abolishing the police, we just want to reform them to make them better.
Nobody should be saying anything about defunding the police. I mean, and I would have no truck with that. I was Director of Public Prosecutions for 5 years.
So today I'm going to talk about why we really do and why we really should want to abolish the police, the prisons and the carceral state, and why the unrealistic vision of police reform, which maintains the carceral state, must be resisted. So this video is cut into three main sections: the history of the police from its origins in slavery and colonialism, what the police are for in the liberal and reformers' imagination, and why such functions are a myth, and what police abolition as a project will look like. It's going to be a longer video than my normal ones, but please stick with me to the end. You'll get a prize. You won't get a prize. Knowledge is the prize.
Break down every day to the dialectic eliminate. You gotta choose one, can you play? It's time for a change. Tick tock, can you see the clock? You just lift up onto the spot. Can you feel it?
When we talk about who and what the police are for, it's really useful to track the historical development of the police in both the UK and the US. We have this image of the police as this universal, natural state of being, that as long as there have been societies, there's been policing. But this is simply not true, and we can track how the police emerged using the example of both the UK and the US. One of the most commonly cited sources for modern policing is the establishment of the London Metropolitan Police under Robert Peel in the 19th century. This is where the word bobbies is supposed to have come from, and with that word comes the sort of congenial image of a local community policeman just wandering around town solving local problems and keeping away ne'er-do-wells. But this image is deeply misleading as to what the emergence of the police was actually like. In fact, policing is steeped in controlling colonial dissent. Peel drew up his blueprints for policing during his time violently suppressing dissent in Ireland, during which time he created the Royal Irish Constabulary, which had the express purpose of quashing dissent. Peel then brought this blueprint over to London with the express purpose of, like in Ireland, quashing dissent, breaking strikes, protecting private property and disciplining the working classes. Strike over unfair working conditions. I'll easy arrest you for that. This wasn't a system which was designed to protect people, but designed to project dominant power. Less the local police officers solving village cases in shows like Midsummer Murders, and more midsummer strike breakers and projectors of racial and capital hierarchies. Which admittedly has less of a ring to it. And this police system was projected across the UK and across the sea to the US, where it was instituted in northern cities with that same ethos of protecting private property, breaking strikes and breaking worker movements. US policing even has similar context in developing oppressive tactics in colonial contexts, having developed several modern policing techniques during the occupation of the Philippines, in Haiti and Nicaragua. And this is ongoing, with US police receiving training on crowd control, use of force and surveillance from Israel's military, police and secret services. Tactics which have been used to suppress Palestinian resistance to occupation. So throughout its development in both the US and the UK, policing has been built on a foundation of colonial oppression and the destruction of worker power. But the emergence of police in the US has more than one strand. As well as the Met model imported from Britain, US policing developed in the South alongside slavery. In southern US cities like Savannah and Charleston, policing developed long before the Met Police model. These southern police forces existed with the express purpose of upholding slavery. They ensured that slaves weren't escaping, that weren't harbouring weapons, or weren't learning to read or write. They existed just to uphold slavery. Once slavery was abolished, these slave patrols were transformed into new professionalised police forces, which altered the mode of oppression of black people from upholding slavery to criminalising them and controlling them through the law. These different origins of policing in America have become merged and become intermingled, and eventually have become today's system of violent, racist police forcing under a system of mass incarceration. Exist as a black man in America? I'll easy arrest you for that. I talk more about this in my video on capitalism and white supremacy, which I'll link about the screen somewhere, which you should check out. It's quite interesting, I think. But my point here is to show that the police force isn't a naturally occurring phenomenon. Like, they're not a natural feature of any society, rather the product of a specific history and specific interests and specific goals. But I'm also trying to show that because the carceral system is the product of this specific history and these specific ideologies, that the idea of reforming these systems to be free of these ideologies is impossible. Because the carceral state will always be racist and oppressive. It will always exist to protect private capital and wealth, because that's what it was made to do. Tinkering with the inside of a car is never going to make it fly. So with this history established, we can begin to see what exactly the police force exists to do. We can see that historically they've existed to protect capital interests and perpetuate racial oppression. But in this section I'm going to take the police functions most often given by liberals and reformers and show why they're essentially bullshit. So one of the main functions that people often give of the police and the prison system is that it helps to reform people back into society. That we need to lock people up to teach them the error of their ways and to teach them how to live as good workers in society. Programs exist to help curb reoffending, like hairdressing, work programs, libraries to gain an education.
The Department of Corrections will pay us money if we allow inmates to attend Greendale using these.
Wait, prisoners?
So we could easily look at the high reoffending rates of prisoners to undermine this idea that prison exists to reform people. But instead let's return to, and if I arrest you, you'll never work again. The reform argument assumes a few things. That the system actually wants to reform people, that being a criminal is as much a matter of personal moral failing as it is the material and social conditions that we live under, so you can be trained to overcome those material and social conditions with work programs and moral fortitude, and that teaching criminals to be better, to work better within the rules of society, will necessarily allow them to do so. These assumptions are false. So without changing the material conditions which produce poverty and inequality, capitalism, and push people into criminalised behaviours like sex work, drug use and sale and robbery, etc., and tying a criminal record to never working again, which is obviously not going to help the alleviation of such material conditions. And maybe a few people learn new skills and get new jobs outside of prison, but many don't, and this isn't going to help solve the societal issue of crime. It doesn't approach any of the social causes of crime. It in fact individualises them. So on top of this, the police and prison system actively criminalises certain groups, particularly black and ethnic minority populations, the working class, or no amount of jail time is ever going to allow people in such groups to transcend that criminalisation. And it's important to note that this criminalisation of black and ethnic minority populations isn't an unfortunate bug in the system, but because of its historical development, particularly, though not exclusively in the US, it's part of its purpose. To repurpose an Althusian argument, the act of imprisoning creates a social relation of subjugation to the police and to the state. As Kant argued, the African American slave, later the black sharecropper and the black industrial proletarian, and today the heinous member of the inner city underclass, have been persistently pictured and processed in national discourse and public policy as enemies of the nation. So the very act of policing creates and maintains social divides and criminalised groups. It both racialises and divides by class, creating particular subjects which are socially useful to dominant power. The police and prisons exist to criminalise black people. It makes their very existence a threat to dominant power and therefore criminal. A third of the US prison population is black, which is 3 times their share of the national population, and a quarter is Hispanic. And if you think this is just a US problem, the Lamy report found that in the UK there's a greater disproportionality in the number of black people in UK prisons than there is in the US. This isn't a US thing, it's a police thing, a racism thing, and a capitalism thing. Rather than reforming people, the prison system is ensuring that they remain criminalised subjects. How can you expect to reform prisoners when the very act of imprisoning them criminalises them and their communities? The other common argument for the existence of the police is that they are the thin blue line that protects order from chaos. This is a particularly gross argument to make in the context of the current protests and strikes, which are a reaction to police systemically murdering black people. Arguing that the police's role is to protect us in this current context really brings up questions of who us is. It again brings up questions of racialised and class-based social categories. The police are protecting white, moneyed people from the criminalised black and working class, which involves systemic murder and mass incarceration. And this view of policing is also in opposition to its historical development of racialised and class-based social control. But let's think about this idea that without the police, society would necessarily collapse, that we need them to hold up social order to keep people safe from violence. This is another charade. The police and prison system doesn't represent a method of de-escalating violence, but increasing it. They don't keep social order in general, but a social order, a racialised capitalist one, which requires violence and disorder managed by the police to exist. The criminalisation of drug use, of sex work, of border crossing, all creates the violence that the police purportedly exist to stop. Policing maintains the social and economic divides which create and drive crime. They create the violence that they supposedly protect us from. But let's consider how much impact the police have on controlling real harms. Take, for example, sexual assault. A tiny proportion of all reported sexual assaults are ever brought to trial, and an even tinier proportion are ever prosecuted. And this is of the tiny proportion that are ever reported. The question then is, why are so few reported? And a wide array of explanations, all coming from the core cause of the patriarchal system under which we live. A significant explanation for this could be that so few reported cases end up being prosecuted and then won. This reflects the reality that the protection function of the police is really a system of protecting particular classes of people from crime. Under patriarchy, men hold the dominant power in society. So the carceral system seeks to protect them and the system of gendered oppression, not the survivors of sexual violence. This question of protecting who is also relevant when we look inside the carceral system itself. Inside prisons, sexual violence is extremely common, and indeed often just part of the system itself. Prison guards will regularly sexually assault both male and female prisoners, and this risk is particularly acute for trans prisoners who are placed in prisons which don't match their gender identities. From this perspective, it's clear that far from protecting people from sexual violence, the carceral system in fact perpetuates it. The police system doesn't protect women. It doesn't protect black and working class communities, so such communities have often historically had to protect themselves. A famous example of this being the Black Panthers, who not only protected black communities from the police but set up social services like the Free Breakfast for Children programme. Women, and particularly black women, have also had to form their own community support and defence programmes to defend themselves and combat sexual violence. For example, the Ubuntu project, formed in Durham, North Carolina, after a black woman was the victim of rape in 2006, was created to protect and support victims of domestic abuse and sexual violence. Such projects only need to exist because the police don't exist to protect people from such social harms, and in many cases exist to perpetuate them. There's not a thin blue line between order and chaos. There are simply groups and interests managed and maintained by a violent and itself chaotic police force. The final commonly cited need for the police and prison system given by liberals and reformers is that we need the police to punish criminals for doing wrong. I'll easy arrest you for that. Following on from the arguments I've already given, you should be able to already see some flaws in this perspective. With some groups criminalised along racial or class lines, what's really being punished isn't crime per se, but simply existing as, say, a black man in America. It's less crime and punishment and more exist to be punished. This perspective is bolstered by the choice of which crimes are defined as worthy of punishment. Take, for example, the biggest category of theft committed in the US, wage theft. I don't mean this in like a Marxian exploitation sense either. I mean that employers literally don't pay their workers the wages that they're owed. This is the biggest category of theft in America, and is anyone ever arrested and jailed for it? Are they fucked? At most, some employers might settle in court if a plaintiff is lucky and or privileged, but jails aren't filled with nascent employers. Just imagine it. No, I'm an abolitionist. What this really encapsulates so well is that punishment isn't deemed necessary for some of the most impactful social harms because those social harms are committed by interests that the police exist to support. Like in terms of protection, punishment of dominant power is not what the police is for, and therefore it will never do it in any systemic way. Another dimension of punishment that we should interrogate is, why do we punish? What does it do? If punishment through jail just makes someone more likely to reoffend, is it really worth it? There are some alternatives to punitive revenge-based justice, like restorative justice, as took place in South Africa's Truth and Reconciliation Commission, in which the offender and the victim speak, and the offender is brought face to face with their actions and their consequences. And this seems to me like a more appropriate way of approaching justice. We're conditioned to believe that justice is an eye for an eye, despite the fable's end in which we all go blind. Surely we can build a system and a society in which justice is a project to strengthen individuals and communities, not destroy them. In the last section, I tried to show how the functions of the police aren't in line with what liberals and reformers say that the functions of the police are. The carceral state doesn't reform, protect or punish, but protects the interests of capitalism and dominant power. In this section then, I'm going to lay out what an abolitionist stance is and why it's not just reforming the police. So firstly, while abolitionists do want the end of policing and the end of the prison system, it's not as simple as clicking your fingers and making them disappear. We don't want to get rid of the public police and have them replaced with private corporate militias, like some anarcho-cap weirdo who looks like a thumb or an egg might. They always look like thumbs, this is weird. As Angela Davis argues, it's not just about tearing down institutions, but reimagining institutions, ideas and strategies, and creating new institutions that render prisons obsolete. As such, police abolition will necessarily include some immediate reforms in the short term to reduce the harm of the police and carceral system. Crucially though, these reforms can't simply move the oppression of the police and prison system to new locations. Some reforms have perversely had the effect of increasing police power through measures such as e-carceration, in which people are held in virtual prisons through digital monitoring. Abolitionists reject such reforms, and instead we should focus on reforms which directly reduce the impact of police power. Measures such as the decriminalisation of drugs, sex work and border crossings could be instituted immediately and would have the immediate effect of directly reducing the size of the police footprint. In America, the police should be immediately disarmed, and Britain should immediately cut off sales in tear gas and rubber bullets to US police forces and oppressive regimes across the world. In this sense, police abolition must be an internationalist project in solidarity with the oppressed across the world. These would be great first steps, but a programme which limited itself here wouldn't be abolitionist. These would lessen the degree of the oppressions that we've talked about today, but it wouldn't solve it. We need to attack the very core causes of oppression within society. And yes, this means attacking the very core of racial capitalism. Toss a coin to your Marxist. Abolishing the police must be an explicit anti-capitalist, anti-racist, anti-patriarchal project, because, as we've seen, building the police was explicitly capitalist, racist and patriarchal. But this is a dialectical project. We need to both end these systems to build socialism and build socialism to end these systems. We need to create new, democratically accountable, horizontally organised structures and communities. We can look to models like the Ubuntu, the Black Panthers and the Truth and Reconciliation Committee to give us some direction for how justice and safety might be approached. Ajera Stickson argues that through this process of building new alternative models to policing, we reshape our ways of engaging with others, that as we do the work changes us, and we change our own values of addressing violence and harm without relying on law enforcement or disposing of community members. This is essential. Our behaviour is structured by the systems in which we exist. Neoliberalism individualises us, racial capitalism segregates us and breeds violence and mistrust. Justice systems based on retribution force us to expect retribution to be the natural state of justice. And as we change these systems, we change ourselves, we change our social body, and we change our assumptions about what's natural, about what's human nature. As Marx argues, toss a coin to your Marxist. We cannot change ourselves without changing the world around us, and we can't change the world around us without changing ourselves. There will be those who say that police abolition is a silly and utopian idea, that we need to be sensible and restructure the police force to be more just. But as Vitali forcefully lays out in his book The End of Policing, reforms to the police only ever go so far as mitigating the harms they cause and never deal with the social ills from poverty to racism to patriarchy that we should in fact be focusing on and fighting. As I've laid out here, the police and prison system was literally built to enforce racism, patriarchy and to protect capital. It cannot reform, it cannot protect, and it can't properly punish the causes of social harm. And in reality it's the idea that we could reform such system which is utopian. We have to destroy this system while building a new and just way to live. Abolition isn't utopian, but the only way to tackle these systems. What is right is practical. So as with any time a leftist or revolutionary idea is projected, there's always someone who asks, what are we going to do in this incredibly specific hypothetical circumstance? And the answer is always necessarily, I don't know. But this isn't a failure of the particular leftist idea. Not knowing what to do about a hypothetical future serial killer post-abolition doesn't destroy the abolitionist argument, because it's not a prescription about how things should be, but a methodology for best understanding how to produce the most just outcomes. We focus on how we should approach such problems, what democratic, horizontally organised frameworks should exist to promote the most just and most effective outcome. We don't decide what to do now with a hypothetical future serial killer, rather we build the best frameworks to help hypothetical future people to make those decisions themselves. We can see this in action if we look again to Ubuntu. Alexis Guns noted that the method used by the organisation after a member encountered a woman who'd been beaten by her former partner, and afterwards described that these responses were invented on the spot, without a pre-existing model or a logistical agreement, but they were also made possible by a larger agreement that we, as a collective of people living all over the city, are committed to responding to gendered violence. They had a method for approaching such issues which allowed them to take action without a pre-existing structure. We don't need to know how future people will respond to specific issues, we just need to build structures and organisations which reflect our method of seeking justice. Not only can we abolish the police, it is our moral duty to do so. Alright, thanks for making it to the end. If you did, if you didn't, you won't be seeing this. I'm afraid there's no prize. I did lie about that. Hopefully you've enjoyed the knowledge. As ever, like and subscribe, and I'd like to thank my patrons, Paul Singleton, Tamash Kispeter, Seamus Morrison, and Stephanie Beverly. And yeah, thanks for watching. Cheers. Toss a coin to your Marxist.
Every day to the dialectic eliminate. You gotta choose one.